Welcome back. This is going to be the last video I make for a while, and there's a few things that I wanted to wrap up, both figuratively and literally. It's probably obvious that over the last year or so, I've acquired, well, quite a bit of gear. Gear acquisition syndrome, lockdown-induced boredom, and some apparently good values all contributed, not to mention, in a few cases at least, the actual need to get something. Not all of them have worked out, and some of those are being shipped on, and some of those are being shipped back. Some are directly related to past videos, like the M1 versus Intel comparison. I promised I'd post performance numbers on the AMD Radeon Pro 7, but 4 months and a week after I ordered it, I was informed by the vendor that the supplier was no longer shipping them. Annoyingly, and contrary to every other order that I've placed with them, they actually part shipped the order, and I've been holding on to the eGPU for about 4 months now and am finally shipping it back. When I get back, I'll wrap up a few open threads. I'll finally talk about my PinePhone and an update on my Librem 5. I'll talk about plans for the next cycle. I've got the latest update on my back-ordered Ollie lens, and which coincidentally dovetails into a segment that I think might be fun. Fun thing to end on. My take on the industry right now. Welcome back. I actually did the first part of this video way back in August. I've actually done the rest of this video 3 times now. I think this is the 4th time. It's just taken me so long to get to that I figured I'd do it again. The purpose of this video was, and is, to provide an update on this channel, to type a few past videos and let you know what the future plans of the channel are. A couple of new products have been released since I started this video, the Canon R3 and the new Apple MacBook Pros. The latter I'll take another look at, and we'll see how well Apple's been able to scale up the chips. The back of the envelope, it seems to put it about 2 times the performance of an Intel 16-inch MacBook Pro with Radeon graphics and DaVinci Raw, but still probably about a quarter of the performance of a maxed out Mac Pro. I mean, with those numbers though, we're talking about $5 to $6 grand compared to 20 to 24 grand. Of course, you can't connect an eGPU to the new MacBook Pros, so you're capping the performance there, whereas you could with the 2019 MacBook Pro, where it will let you add additional graphics cards via eGPUs and Thunderbolt. And those numbers assume ProRes, which is accelerated on the 2021 model, but not the 2019 model. In general, if it's accelerated in hardware, the M1 seem to be great, whereas if it needs to be done on the CPU, you're not going to see any benefit over the current M1s unless you are really memory intensive and you make use of that extra bandwidth. Regardless, we'll see how it exactly performs in another video, and I expect Darktable performance to increase in line with the GPU as well. Based on the number Apple has given, the GPU performance seems to be expected to scale about linearly from the M1 to the M1 Max. That's 2.6 teraflops up to 10.4 teraflops, which beats any AMD mobile chip, but is just about half of an RTX 3080 mobile or 3070 desktop. I never did branch off into a second channel, but my plan is to try and weave a combination of tech and photography into this channel. Hopefully there's enough overlap for that to be interesting. I've got 2 more videos planned, the OM 150-400 Pro and the Apple M1 Max. Then, as I said at the top, I'm going to take a break from posting for a while. The videos to date have given me opportunities to learn, tweak, and get a feel for what works best. Static camera mounts work better than attempting to rig up an old iPhone. C-stands work better than flimsy light stands that keep falling over. And lav mics are invaluable, which I keep forgetting to use, but so is a boom mic in a sort of quiet room, and one of the things I'm going to do during the break is work on some of the acoustic treatment of this room. I'm currently recording this on multiple mics since I haven't fully figured out my setup yet, so there's a lot of learning still in progress. It's been interesting watching more established channels and seeing their presenters changing over the past year, talking about stepping back or changing their format. The nice thing about this being basically a learning exercise is I haven't really been preoccupied with the YouTube algorithm, but even then I've rushed a couple of videos, and I'm not really pleased with the outcome in those cases, like the Apple AMD video. I've got some ideas for videos in the next cycle, and for the most part I expect they'll be less review-focused. My plan is to talk more about workflow and why I've chosen the equipment which I have. Why do I have RF, M, and Micro Four Thirds cameras? I want to focus more on rationale in hopes that it'll be helpful rather than just showing things. I also plan on doing some more technical topics, things like bit depth and color spaces, although I'm still tweaking the format a bit. Maybe file formats, although that's probably too far off the technical end. Please let me know if there's any area in particular of interest to you. Less review focused, of course, doesn't mean no reviews at all. Probably the category of photography equipment where I've thrown the most fruitless money. Trying to find some idealized object is camera bags. I'll discuss what hasn't worked and for what I've been looking. My Indiegogo Gitsa bag and Kickstarter Shimoda bags arrived just before I started recording one of the earlier versions of this, and I've got several others that I've been using recently, so I'll do a mass review of sorts there. Potentially another exception may be the Panasonic GH6. I admit despite failings in customer support so far and continued flakiness in their macOS software, I'm considering the GH6 based on the specs teased earlier and having been using the BGH1 untethered for most of this year. At the time I last recorded this video, I was dealing with a lot of customer support frustration and had dealt a bit long on that. I had a great experience with Elvid. I've got a couple of 5-inch monitors from them, and one of them arrived with its fan stuck on high. Normally they're extremely quiet. I shipped it out on a Friday afternoon and received a replacement Tuesday morning. That stood out as the one positive experience I was having. I never did get a response from Panasonic about what was going on with my BGH1s, even when signing up for the base level of their professional services program, which is just disappointing. I've really grown fond of their cameras, but would be worried about building a business around them given the service levels, compared to, in particular, Canon, who realizes that the Canon professional services is a fundamental aspect of their professional identity, or even Leica, who, while not exactly catering to the same audience, had exceptional post-service communication when I was worried about the issues I was having with the Q2 resurfacing. I'm told this was a relatively recent change in the New Jersey Service Center in the past couple of years. I do know that I had some quirky behavior with my X2 a few years back, and it was impossible to reach anybody then. I've bought an eGPU and a Radeon 7 Pro, if you recall from my M1 video, which B&H decided to part ship, despite standard practice for them being shipped once all items are together, and then canceled my Radeon 7 after several months. And at that point, they said it was discontinued, but that Radeon 7 Pro is still 2 months later available on their website, but at a 50% markup from what I'd ordered in Q1. And at the same time, this was all while getting bounced back and forth with a printer manufacturer where B&H's sale page included macOS support, but the drivers were never updated for 64-bit macOS, making them unusable for current machines. Beyond that, in order to use the paper B&H was selling the new higher quality rolls, the printer needed a firmware update, which required Windows operating systems, and apparently needs a roll of standard quality paper so that the software doesn't see an error state. The whole thing was frustrating, and basically the two companies left me to make a claim on my credit card's purchase protection rather than do anything about it. That's the short version. Anyway, moving on, and apropos of nothing, I'm sure, let's return to one of my earliest topics, the Librem 5. The last time I really used it was in April, and at that time it seemed like the UI was feeling more responsive, but also as if it were unlikely to ever leave the hobbyist level. Each of the issues I'd mentioned in December were still present with current updates in April, including occasionally losing time and resetting to the distant future, an issue that they had said was solved before that. At that time, I'd planned on sending it to someone who had indicated a greater availability of time to hack on it, and that was delayed in part by the annoying habit of the phone to effectively stop charging, run down its battery, and requiring some button combination before it would recharge again. By the time I went to wipe any personal information and update it, well, I'd have a flat battery and I'd need to go through the whole process again. So no, I haven't changed my opinion on it, and the only improvements I've seen actually shipped out via end-user updater are that the Japanese keyboard works, and since April I haven't had it lose the current date. I know there are other improvements happening that haven't shipped, like being able to take a photo from the command line, but well, even after having updated in mid-August one last time, it just seems like a waste of good talent in my opinion. Since April, the UI has actually gotten less responsive, often not seeming to recognize taps on buttons. Maybe things have changed in the last couple of months. I shipped it to the new owner after the last cut of the video, but it seems like news has mostly died down, although I still get emails from Purism seeking investors in the company, and apparently the price is going up again on the Librem 5. Whenever that gets mentioned, the topic of the price, some people jump on whoever's talking about it to explain why, and I understand why. I think those just were poor choices from Purism and not the right trade-offs to make. In contrast, the Pine64 phone has actually gotten more responsive. It's still surprisingly cheap for a low-volume phone. Yes, the specs aren't as high, and has, from what I've seen, much more community involvement, which offloads a lot of the work to make it better. There are several different variants and distributions. I got the KDE community version. If you recall from my video, that's the one I had recommended that Librem would actually go with. Now, I can't recommend the Pine64 phone as a daily driver either, but then they're very clear that's not the intent. The camera is a little slow, the window manager and composite are a little bit quirky, especially if you rotate the phone frequently and it decides to draw the window partly off screen. But if you want to use it as a basic PDA or smartphone, it seems to work, and the form factor isn't bad. It's a quirky experience, and it's not for everyone, but there is a really interesting community and ecosystem around it, and I find that really exciting. Otherwise, there's not really much to say about it, which is why I never did a full video. It's pretty much exactly what they advertise. Unlike the Librem, if you want a Linux or simply an open phone that's usable as a daily driver on the public mobile networks, Android open source project AOSP drive projects, basically Lineage, look like the only game in town. Briefly on the GH6, I'm curious to see how it handles as a secondary camera to the EM1X. To support 5.7K video recording, we're looking at a newer, slightly higher resolution sensor, around 24 megapixels compared to the 20 megapixel sensors Olympus and Panasonic have so far used on the high end. The two biggest spec questions I, and probably many others, have are, How good will the new sensors be compared to the larger full-frame competitors with respect to higher ISO noise control? And the other one. Dynamic range ought to be at least as good as the current generation, although it may not yet reach the levels of Panasonic's full-frame options, and I haven't seen any details on the in-body image stabilization, which Panasonic has been including in most of its newer models, such as the 6.5 stop rated 5-axis dual IS2 and the GH5 Mark II. Of course, even if there is IBIS, that likely wouldn't work in conjunction with the Ollie stabilized lenses, so it looks like it's unlikely to surpass the EM1X for action photography, where I'm currently using the 40-150 or the 150-400 Pro lenses. Now, Panasonic has promised updates to its autofocus system, and there are rumors about what that means. Some websites keep repeating the same source, saying that that means the GH6 will have phase detect autofocus. And while that would address its perennial weakness, I doubt that's the case. Some commenters online have suggested that this was unlikely because it would mean Panasonic would need to release all new lenses, which simply isn't true. Phase detect and contrast-based focusing systems do place different demands on the lenses, with the former requiring the ability to quickly and precisely make large jumps and the latter requiring the ability to smoothly rack focus over a smaller region. But any Micro Four Thirds lens from either Olympus or Panasonic should work fine with either phase detect or contrast detect systems, that is, assuming the lens supports autofocus. These lenses are designed to quickly focus electronically and are capable of making quick jumps phase detect requires. As always, if you have a counterexample, do feel free to mention it in the comments. Panasonic continues to talk about the drawbacks of phase detect. In a recent interview, Lumix director Yamane-san was very particular in doing so, without entirely espousing Panasonic's depth from defocus contrast detect autofocus system. This has led to even more speculation about what the next generation system would entail, such as time-of-flight LiDAR-based systems like Apple uses in their iPhone devices. That sort of hybrid configuration would be pretty neat, and seems like something that could be added into the system without changing the principal imaging system, and seems like it could be incredibly effective, especially in low light, having played with the iPhone Pro's implementation. The contrast detect system is also ideal for IR-modded cameras. An infrared-based time-of-flight focusing system could complicate that, in case that's a concern for anyone else. Even without AF improvement, though, considering I've been fond of how the BGH1s are working, I could see the GH6 complementing it nicely. Since I'm ending the cycle, there's one more self-indulgence in which I'd like to partake. I've put the major camera systems on some note cards and wanted to give basically my take on them since I'll be off for a while, so my take in sort of like a stock weighting sort of way, buy, sell, or hold. I grouped some related systems together. To be perfectly open, most of this opinion is based on limited use of the systems. It's based on secondhand and third-hand experiences, publicly available specs, and reviews. In some cases, that may play to the system's benefit or to its detriment. For some context, these are the 3 cameras I'd be most eager to try out, but haven't yet had the opportunity. Let's get started. Fuji GFX. Buy. I included a few medium format systems in the set, and by and large, the most promising right now is the GFX, if you're looking to increase your sensor size or resolution. The GFX 100S is a comparatively cheap $6,000 US, and the lenses aren't astronomically priced either. The GFX 50S2, on the other hand, it just doesn't seem worth it as a principal camera. The benefits over a 35mm camera aren't there, and I wouldn't buy into the system for that. Keep in mind that medium format cameras are not drop-in replacements for 35mm cameras. You won't get the same quality autofocus in particular, and handling will generally not be as good either. It will generally be a lot clunkier. Canon EF. I love my EF, but this is a sell. This is a hard one, and to be honest, I'm holding on to my EF and EFS lenses. There's still a real market for EF lenses with several adapters letting you use them on RF mount systems, and there's a continued market for video depending on the lens. However, Canon's been clear that it sees EF as dead, and all new Canon cameras are going to go RF rather than EF, and that will lead to other manufacturers switching, as we've already seen with Red. So if you plan on selling, sell soon. Canon RF, on the other hand, is a buy. This is the future of the Canon glass, and the R3 is a camera that I wanted a year ago, but at this point with the R6 and the EM1X, I'm holding out for the next generation. RF still has a price premium built in, and if you're principally interested in entry level, I'd wait a bit longer unless you see any good deals. We're getting to the end of the year, and this is usually the time where we see discounts, at least in the US market. The EF adapter does open up opportunities for used lenses, many of which will be much heavier than the RF equivalents, but there are also some more esoteric options, not just to mention if you're trying to deal with availability, such as ones with tilt-shift movements. Of course, Darktable still hasn't released a version that supports CR3 files, but the code's there. You can manually build it. Hopefully, it'll be in 3.8. Last year, Darktable had a special release towards Christmas, but normally they only do once a year, and 3.6 was just released in September. So it seems unlikely it'll be in a release this year. Fuji X. This is a buy. Fuji X's line is well established at this point, with plenty of used options available, and new inventory from the mid-range XT30 and XE4 from around 800, 900, although the XT4 and X Pro 3 are about twice that cost. Not the first choice I'd take for sports or wildlife, but there are even some native lens options which could work depending on the specific situation. It's not a bad lens system. Leica M, speaking of not bad lens systems, this is a buy. There are plenty of used options, and kept in good condition, they're unlikely to go down in value or price. So if you're interested in jumping into or already are in the M world, the only thing that should stop you is the cost. For more on the M mount, you can take a look at my video contrasting the fixed lens Leica Q2 and the M10, which talks about some of the drawbacks of the M mount as well as why I like it so much. Nikon F, strong sell. Nikon has been a bit of a mess, and unlike Canon, they're trying to keep both the F and newer Z mounts alive. Now, Nikon may be the biggest change since I recorded this last time. The Nikon Z9 or Z9 is a surprisingly exciting release from Nikon, and previously I would have just suggested that if you like the tech of the Nikon cameras to date, you'd probably be better off doing what the Associated Press did and switch to Sony, who manufactures Nikon sensors. The Z9, on the other hand, shows where Nikon is heading, and it looks promising. So the switch to the Z mount is starting to look more solid, but still, I would say that Nikon Z is a hold. This is one rating where I was on the edge of changing, but one camera doesn't make a system. I wouldn't buy into the Z mount from nothing, and not just because Nikon lenses are backwards. The Z mount makes a lot of sense right now if you're invested in Nikon already. You like their UI and their general workflow. I still have reservations from Nikon's lack of clear direction over the last few years, but the Z9 may be indicative of their collapsing onto their future direction. If Heisenberg had been talking about the photo industry's transition from SLRs into mirrorless, his uncertainty theory may have been written with Nikon in mind. What do I like about the Z9? In a lot of ways, it's a cheaper A1. Not in every way, but by tech and specs, it looks very similar. And that isn't really what I like. It just keeps it in the flagship ballpark. What I really like is the removal of the shutter. I often shoot with the electronic shutter on my OMD M1X and less often on the R6. I'm not exactly sure why. Supposedly there's some reduction dynamic range with the Canons. I certainly don't notice it on the EM1X, and I can't really say that I noticed it on the R6 either, in real world shooting anyway. But what Nikon's saying with the Z6 is that those aren't concerns anymore. The electronic shutter's performance is so good there's no reason to even think about a physical shutter, which, beyond the noise that the shutter makes, eventually it will fail if you use your camera long enough. The readout speeds are so good, it's the only option. Don't worry about rolling shutter, don't worry about dynamic range reduction, or any other issues. It's always going to be whisper quiet, which is increasingly important from a working pro, or parents at a recital for your kids. Of course, we don't yet know for sure if dynamic range or anything else might not be affected by going into the full 20 frames per second burst mode. Nikon has a long history of creating robust, well-handling professional cameras, rivaled only by Canon. And I'm not forgetting Sony here. Nikon's made some cuts to their professional services program and warranties over the past couple of years, but they're showing they haven't forgotten what photographers want in a workhorse. And that's why the Z9 looks very exciting. Micro Four Thirds. Bye. Now there's uncertainty and the tech is long in the tooth at the moment, but the current crop of lenses and promise of new bodies arriving very soon, not to mention a large used market, pre-pandemic anyway, make Micro Four Thirds a good option to choose. You go back to my first video where I talk about why I bought into Micro Four Thirds at the start of the year. Sony E-mount. Bye. Everything's turning up Sony. The A1 demonstrated what Sony could throw into a body for those that needed the utmost power, while the A6000 is available at the entry level, and they've got bodies all in between. Sony's got the oldest continuous mirrorless mount system, which also means a broad used market, and they've built out a competitive lens catalog. Last time I recorded this, I bit my tongue and didn't mention Sony's reliability issues. I personally don't have great experience with Sony durability across many of their product lines, but not a lot of experience with their camera system. And I figured if the APA had switched to them, I should wait and see and let history speak for itself. But since James Popsis has been going on about the issues he's had with his Sonys, I figured it's fair game to list it as a caveat. Pentax K. Hold. If it works for you, keep shooting it. If you're looking to grow your system or buy into a new system, though, I think you'll get better value out of used Sony or Fuji or Micro Four Thirds camera. Hasselblad H. I'm going to go with hold. Either you know you want to be in the system or not, probably because someone else is funding it. On the X, though, I'd also say this is a hold. Hasselblad updated its X1D after 3 years, so if we continue to see that pattern, I think we'd see a new version next June. I'm not holding my breath again for when that might be released. Compared to Fuji's GFX line, it just isn't evolving. And finally, that leaves the Leica L mount, or the L mount alliance. While there are some nice aspects and standout models, the S1 variants in particular, I just haven't seen a convincing reason to switch the L mount over other options. So let's summarize the season. Micro Four Thirds is still the best value for money in my opinion. If you want a free and open mobile phone, go with Lineage OS or Replicant if it supports a current model. Be careful with fancy Android phones since they likely have a short shelf life. Don't buy a drone. My Leica Q2 definitely does still sometimes look like it takes a shot without saving it, but it's a much shorter time frame from when I turned it on in which it's affected. And it isn't locking up, so it's not ideal, but it's not the same problem it was before. In fact, it did it again this weekend, and oddly, when it started up again, after I had to turn it off and back on, it was in video mode, which was new. It hadn't done that before. Don't buy a computer in this market if you can help it. Except maybe one of those new M1 Macs if they fit your workflow. Yes, still don't expect Apple M chips to perform miracles. I think they make much more sense in laptops than desktops. They're great for basic office and everyday consumption tasks, and the M1 Max does look impressive. I'm interested to see how they actually perform, and most importantly, how they perform relative to the original M1. I'm hoping that gives us some clue as to the trajectory into the higher-end workstations. And I still don't see an M-based Mac Pro being competitive in many of the workloads that people would want to throw at a Mac Pro or other workstation computer. But it looks like Apple is chipping away at the lower-end user base of the Mac Pro, and at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if I'm wrong about the upcoming Mac Pro's ability to compete with AMD or Intel chips in most creative workflows. I'm excluding NVIDIA-optimized modeling and simulations with terabyte plus of RAM and other super high-end systems, which I'm guessing are not going to be what Apple's targeting and likely weren't buying Apple products to begin with. For pure power, x86-64 still trounces the Apple M chips, but if you're looking for power per watt, that's entirely different. And for many people, the M1 is going to be the right choice, operating system support aside. That's it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.